I'm delighted to be in Slovenia today and to be partners in the Bled Strategic Forum and be here on this beautiful day by the lake, talking about a not always beautiful subject in Brexit. I'm used to chairing panels on Brexit and saying this is a particularly timely point to discuss Brexit because it always feels that we're at some moment of crisis or inflection or change. I still think, if it's not hyperbole, that's very much true today. In Parliament, there is going to be a bill put forward supported by opponents of leaving the EU with no deal, which will seek to block no deal through legislative means, and that may well, in the end, trigger a general election, which may or may not happen before the 31st of October, and which may or may not lead to some clarity about where Britain will end up. We've got a great panel here today. I'd like to kind of think about Brexit, not just in terms of the specifics of what will happen today or tomorrow or up to the 31st of October, but also to think a little bit about what we've learned from the last couple of years of the negotiations and where we might end up, the UK and the EU, over the slightly longer term. So I'm going to introduce the panel. We're going to give each of them an opportunity to speak, but also hopefully to have some discussion between us. But then we'd really like to get comments and thoughts and contributions from the audience too. So to start with, on my left is Gisela Stewart. Gisela was an MP from 1997 until 2017. She was a Labour MP, I should add. She was chair of the Vote Leave campaign, co-chair alongside Michael Gove. And so been involved with the referendum from the outset, was one of the Leave speakers at the famous Wembley debate. And Gisela is now the chair of Change Britain, which is the sort of successor organisation, I think that's fair, of Vote Leave, the bit that isn't in Downing Street anyway. To her left is Chris Cook. Chris is a partner and editor at Tortoise Media, which is a new sort of startup media company. Chris was formerly the public policy editor at Newsnight, which is one of the BBC's flagship current affairs programmes. And before that, he was working at the FT, where he shared an office, I believe, with Martin Sambu, who is the FT's economics editor. You may know him from sending the always interesting and engaging free lunch email and writing about economics and all issues of finance and the intersection with politics too. And then to my right is Stefan de Rink, who is one of the top advisors to Michel Barnier in Task Force 50. You've worked for Mr. Barnier in several different capacities in his different roles over the years, but been involved with the Brexit negotiations from the outset, I believe. So, Gisela, I'd like to start with you and to get your thoughts on how you feel about where we are 3 years after the vote. Did you think it would be this difficult to leave the European Union? Did you anticipate that it would involve the sort of political contest that it has domestically, and where you think we might end up?
I could say yes, of course, to all these questions, but this would be utter travesty of the facts. Well, what I thought of trying to do, and should I do about 5 minutes? Or
that would be perfect.
Yeah. I'm going to try and attempt to answer two questions and do them in reverse order. The first one is what I call the Mervyn King question, the former governor of the Bank of England, who about 18 months ago appeared on the Today programme, and he said, you have to ask yourself how a country with the 5th, 6th largest economy in the world, with a reputation for administrative capacity and political stability, has managed to get itself into such a mess. And the second question I would try and answer is how come a German like me, who at the age of 18 went to the United Kingdom during the 3-day week when the country really was a basket case, it just about joined the then economic community. I then spent 15 months in the company of Giscard d'Estaing and Michel Barnier trying to draft the European Constitution. How come that someone like me ended up campaigning to leave the European Union? And I think unless you try and start to answer these two questions, you will never get to anything that even vaguely gets us out of the hole we're in. Because we are currently living in 3 parallel universes, and each side accuses the other of not listening, whilst they busily themselves are about as tone deaf as could be possible. The Leave campaign was about place, community, identity. The Remain campaign was about economic prosperity, the prospect of a better tomorrow, which, by the way, underpinned the political structures of the original idea of the European Union. I think we've forgotten what the original forces were to set it up. You did away with ideologies, you did away with the nasty underbelly of nationalism in exchange for bureaucratic boredom that delivers you a better tomorrow. European countries trusted each other again within the mantle of NATO. Never ever forget that. And up until 1973, a nation state within Europe had a choice on how it wished to relate to its neighbors. It could relate to them via trade or could relate to them via economic integration. The United Kingdom kind of joined in 73, thinking it was still about economic integration and never changing its mind. And you could argue that the 2016 referendum was the logical conclusion of the Maastricht opt-outs. That once the euro was actually introduced, it wasn't a question of if, it was a question of when. So that's when people like me, when David Cameron called the referendum, my own initial response was, why have a national referendum in order to resolve a party political internal dispute? And I originally really didn't want to get involved. And I asked myself, what would it take for me to campaign for Remain rather than leave? Because David Cameron did what Harold Wilson did in the 70s. He said, I'm renegotiating. Wilson came back with nothing, but it looked as if it was a renegotiation. And for me, if David Cameron had come back with a deal which said the European Union acknowledges and accepts and prepares for, not as a matter of opt-outs in the case of Denmark and the UK, but as a matter of its further expansion, that it will forever have countries which are part of the single currency, the euro, and others which are not. I would have said, okay, let's give this a try. Because I would suggest to you that what you will look at in the years to come is completely new dividing lines. And the dividing lines will be between debtor countries and creditor countries. It will be who underwrites this. You will have countries who will hold elections but not actually influence the policies. Greece. In Greece, you can change the government, but have the policies changed? No, because that's part of or you're going to have countries which elect extremists because the population thinks, oh, but Brussels will never let them do it. That's, people like Ivan Krastev in the Red House in Sofia will argue that's what's happening in Hungary and Poland at the moment. These are deep and serious tensions, which the United Kingdom's decision to leave is highlighting, but I would suggest is not causing. Which then takes, so this is why I ended up campaigning for leave. I would have wanted a referendum on the Lisbon Treaty, but we didn't have one. Then it takes, why did the UK get itself into such a mess? I think what has happened, the reason why the current position is so insoluble is because democracies have institutions, and those institutions allow you to reach compromises when you've got clashing ideas. But none of these institutions at the moment are in a position to do so because the fault lines go completely across it. So you've got the front benches of both parties being out of sync with their backbenchers. Labour's position is the most unclear one. You have got MPs being out of step with how their electors voted. You've got England and Wales being out of step with how Scotland and Northern Ireland voted. And all those institutions which actually could reach agreement can't because it's just cutting so across. So what will happen next? I don't know what's going to happen in the next 6 weeks, but I can tell you broadly what I think will happen. You will have a kind of realignment of the people who call themselves being members of the Labour Party or members of the Conservative Party or members of the Liberals. And I deliberately call them Liberals rather than the Lib Dems. And I think the greatest threat for the party political structure is actually for the Labour Party, just as the Social Democrats across Europe are finding it hardest. I think that for the Conservatives, as they've already done in Scotland, in Scotland, Scotland used to be the powerhouse, the brain house of the Labour Party, the big figures of the Blair government, came from Scotland. So did the ideas. In Scotland, we were destroyed, completely destroyed by the Scottish nationalists. And we have now a position where to be a Scottish nationalist is progressive, left-wing and trendy. To be an English nationalist is terribly racist and awful. Now, that starts to tell you that things are happening within language and which identification. And in Scotland, the 2017 general election was about unionists and nationalists. And the nationalists were to the left of Labour, and the unionists were the Conservatives in that sense. And so there will be a general election at some stage. And at that stage, the challenge will be whether the Conservatives can bring in those people who voted for the Brexit Party. To what extent the Liberals under a new leader take away from Labour. And Labour, having lost its core vote, other than in big cities, could end up like the American Democrats and being the party of public sector workers, but that's not sufficient to actually form a government. So, plus the United Kingdom relationship, I think, will be changing. However, I just leave you with one prediction. Because in essence, this has been how do we relate to our neighbours? That is the big challenge. And on a global sphere, the United Kingdom's strategic position had always been that it did not want to have continental Europe dominated by one power. So therefore, the engine will go back to being France and Germany. Just look at the last appointments in the European Commission. I couldn't believe it. I am older than the European Union. I was born in 1955. I grew up with that any German chancellor knew that the way Germany behaved in the European Union, or whatever you called it, was that it was disproportionately generous to smaller countries. That's the way you actually held the thing together. Look at the appointments. Who's run by it? Belgium, France, Germany, Italy, Spain. If I'm a country that joined in 2004, I would go and look at this European Union and say, where's my voice? So I think these are big tensions. And I think in 50 years' time, it will be seen as more remarkable that the United Kingdom decided to join in 1973 than that it decided to leave in 2016.
Thanks. Can I ask you one just quick question in response? If you were a Labour MP, would you have voted for the deal? At the time? Well, I know that you stood down in 2017, but would you have voted for the deal at the time?
It's quite interesting. The Saturday before the third vote, I wouldn't have voted the first time. When it came to the third vote, it was May, Mrs. May in May. I actually wrote an op-ed saying, folks, it's time to hold your nose. You may not like it, but you're either going to deliver or, you can't go on like this. And I remember at that time texting Boris Johnson and saying, Boris, I just think you need to know that I'm doing that. And he texted back saying, I know exactly why you're doing this. And on the Monday, he voted for the deal as well.
Yeah, which has been somewhat erased from recent history, hasn't it? Including Jacob Rees-Mogg voted for the deal too, and most of the Conservative Party.
Well, but this was driven not because we thought this was one, and full marks to Michel Barnier. I think he's been the most extraordinary negotiator, and we've played just about every hand wrong as we could have. I think it was at a time you thought you're either going to get this over the line or you don't.
Thanks, Stefan. Maybe that's a nice segue, given you've had some effusive praise of your boss there. Do you think it was inevitable that the deal would look the way that it does? Is it simply a product of the power relationship combined with the red lines of the two sides? Was there really very much room for manoeuvre, and is there any more room for manoeuvre in the next 8 weeks?
Thank you. I can't hide the impression that the effusive praise for Michel Barnier was somewhat also grounded in he's a tough negotiator who played a good game against the UK, which is not the case, I would say. I mean, we were notified Article 50, and at that point we said, okay, the UK is going to leave, as much as we regret that. That's just the way it will be, and under the treaties, that's what we will negotiate. So let's try and find the best way of supporting the UK's withdrawal, if I put it like that, which is quite odd for the European Commission to say, but that's the responsibility we had under the treaty. Now, did it have to go in the way it went? the 27 leaders were quite quick off the mark in June 16 to say, we are not going to let the single market unravel. This is a fundamental challenge for the European Union. It came in 2016 after 8 years of quite acrimonious divisions between EU member states on quite a number of important issues, including the Eurozone that Gisela referred to. And I think in that sense, that shock to the system was kind of saying, well, we need to make sure that our foundational principles come out intact of this process. And therefore, we have been extremely adamant on what we call the integrity of the single market, the foundational principles of how the single market works, because that's our main assets in today's global economy. And it's also the main assets between member states in terms of the glue that keeps member states together. And so when the UK then came with ideas of saying, well, we're going to keep quite a bit of the benefits of that single market, the Theresa May government, without necessarily having all the obligations from outside of the institutional framework, it was seen as an essential threat to how the EU works as a system. So in that sense, in terms of the economic relationship, and I'll say a little bit more about that in terms of the declaration where we stand today, I think that was indeed inevitable, the marriage of the red lines and the foundational principles, the UK's red lines and the foundational principles of the EU. The second issue is the important issue again for the EU was what we call the integrity of our legal order, of also in more plain language, the autonomy of our decision making. That you cannot give a voice to the decision making in the EU to a country that has decided to leave, which we had quite a bit of discussions that showed that the UK saw itself as having a continued voice in EU decision-making, especially in economic decision-making, post-Brexit, even though it wanted to leave the institutional framework. And then, of course, there's the Irish question, where everything came then together, the conundrum of the UK leaving the single market, leaving the customs union, hence friction at the border, and the UK's commitment to keep that border fully open, which is at the heart of what the UK government says is the issue today. At the same time, I should say, was it inevitable to come to this end point? Are we at the end point? Because if you look at the political declaration, the way we have constructed, and that's the most important part from me, because the withdrawal agreement is, if it is ratified, or if it had been ratified with the third vote, as Gisela just said, we would now be in a discussion where people would gradually start getting out of that logic of the withdrawal agreement, because by its nature, it has to become history very soon, because it's about withdrawal, it's about the past. And if you look at the future and the political declaration which we agreed with Theresa May's government, which is the most important part for me, of these negotiations, the irony of the UK Parliament being unable to vote for the agreed package, in part because some people thought this relationship wasn't close enough, in part because some MPs thought this relationship wasn't distant enough in terms of economic relationship. All of that can be accommodated by the declaration as we have constructed it. Because the declaration says basically we have a free trade agreement with the UK as a baseline, and we can top it up. Now, I understand that this government wants not to top it up, but have a pure free trade agreement, no longer talk about regulatory alignment with the EU. That is something the declaration accommodates for, but the government wants, and we are ready to do so, if and when it wants to do so, is to rework the political declaration according to what the Johnson government sees as its preference.
Isn't the fact that it's that broad and able to accommodate that many different end states in a way also the problem, because it's a guarantee of none of them?
Yeah, but if you look at the indicative votes in the Westminster House of Commons, none of the forms of Brexit received a majority.
Yeah.
And the form based on the FTA certainly didn't receive a majority compared to some other ideas on single market style of relationship or customs union style of relationship, or a mix, which we're all willing to discuss as long as we maintain our foundational principles and the proper balance of rights and obligations. So no, I don't buy that actually, because at some point you need to say, well, yes, we want to leave the European Union as Parliament, and everything is still to play for in a way for the future relationship, which we on our side wants to be as close as possible, subject to respect for our foundational principles. So to come to the final part of your question, well, what's next? Well, we're ready to do that work on reworking the political declaration, which may not be that easy because the current government in terms of fair competition and standards on fair competition may well have different ideas compared to the previous government, and that's a fundamental issue for the EU27 in terms of fair competition standards between the EU and the UK. And we're ready to look at any proposal the UK may come up with on alternative arrangements to keep the Irish border fully open, compatible with the withdrawal agreement, because that's what we constructed step by step. So by and large, I think the package on the table reflects the May government's red lines and the EU's foundational principle, and that's basically what we concluded.
And just on it would be good to talk a little bit more about Ireland and the situation and the complexities that the border creates and the necessities for the backstop. Can you, to me it seems, I don't want to prejudge your answer, but the idea that the Boris Johnson administration can come up with in 2 months a legally operable alternative that would pass muster with the EU27 that wasn't able to be come up with in the previous 2.5 years of negotiation, or that the EU was unwilling to agree to. Do you think there's any possibility for political movement amongst the EU27, because they're also obviously interested in finding a way through the impasse?
Well, we were unwilling to agree to any idea that would undermine the integrity of the single market, as well as the delicate balance of the Good Friday Agreement in terms of Northern Irish politics. So that's what we were unwilling to agree to. The Cambridge Dictionary, I think, says about a backstop that it is a plan or a method that you have in case any other plan or method fails. And we're still and that's still what the withdrawal agreement says. This plan is an insurance policy for the stability and peace on the island of Ireland, and it's also an insurance policy that gives the EU the guarantees that the single market's integrity will be respected. And perhaps there, coming back to your initial question, the negotiations could have gone differently, because the most difficult moment for us as negotiation team with the EU27 was when the UK asked for a customs-wide backstop dimension. So the UK said, we don't want the Northern Irish specific customs solution, we want this customs solution to be UK-wide. And there Michel Barnier, the team, put quite a lot of political capital in working with the 27 to make sure that they could accept that. Hence the level playing field conditions, the fair competition standards that are part of this backstop. So, parenthesis closed. Coming back to your question. We have committed already in March with Geoffrey Cox and Steve Barclay to work on the alternative arrangements. And there are certain commitments in there that are serious that would kick in upon ratification of the withdrawal agreement in terms of finding alternative arrangements to the backstop. That position has not changed. But you have to be realistic here. I mean, the UK government says we want a very hands-off, distant economic relationship, more than the previous government. And what I would qualify as the most serious work done so far in the UK on alternative arrangements, which is Prosperity UK, kind of piloted by Greg Hans, I believe, and Nicky Morgan. If you look at what they come up with, they say, well, in terms of timing, we don't really know, because it depends on resources, capacity, political leadership, and a common vision. And we also need the EU to derogate from a number of its rules for this to make it work. So we saw them last Friday. We had a very good discussion with the people some of the people at least, who were involved in that report. And we're certainly willing to take that work forward. But clearly from their own work, it says, well, we're not ready, we're not there yet. And you cannot ask the EU to say, well, nothing else is ready, let's just eliminate the backstop and pretend that we're all okay. No, that's not okay.
But you could make the decision at the end of the transition period, rather than requiring a solution now before one can't be ready. I guess that would be the criticism of the Brexiteers, is that sequencing is part of the problem, and you have a withdrawal agreement which creates a future relationship for however long we don't know, because it's dependent on when the alternative arrangements reach. But there is that tension in the sequencing, and in a way I remember David Davis saying he was going to Brussels, this was the battle of the summer that he was going to win on sequencing, and he lost. And the sequencing has been very strict, and it's been a very effective, I would say, negotiating tool from the EU. But there is that tension between the fact that this is withdrawal, but it creates a future relationship of unknown duration.
But
You accept that?
I think it would be irresponsible to go down that route given the Good Friday Agreement, given the challenges that there are on the island of Ireland. So I don't think we would want to go down that route.
Okay, thanks. Chris, perhaps I could turn to you now. You have written a majestic study, which you have some copies of, which goes through all of the, it's called Defeated by Brexit, and it was serialised in tortoise. Modelled perfectly here. And in that, you go throughout all the negotiations, but you focus a fair bit on the relationship between the UK and Ireland and how fundamental that's been to the negotiation process. Why do you think it has been so difficult for the UK to make progress on Brexit, and how central has the relationship with Ireland and the situation in Northern Ireland and the UK's, the progress that had been made in Northern Ireland and what's at stake? How much has that kind of held back building a consensus in the UK?
Sure. So I think Gisela said one of the questions is, how does a state with a reputation for administrative capacity and stability end up in this state? I think one of the truth about Brexit is it's revealed something that actually in their heart of hearts British people tend to know. If you go back to which is that we have a really badly run state, right? So if you go back to the 2012 Olympics, British people's anticipation of the London Olympics was that it was going to be a disaster because we know what our state is like. So all the recent welfare reforms have been a disaster, all the recent healthcare reforms have been a disaster, all the recent education reforms have been a disaster. Things either cost too much or they don't work. Our public services sort of chug along sort of medium efficiently. We're a normal OECD country. We put enormous energy into continually trying to make them better, and they never really work. We have very little patience for things that take a long time. We have a generalist civil service that doesn't allow expertise to bed in. We keep moving people. And Brexit is has been a sort of proof of the problems in our state. So to Mervyn King's point, Mervyn King, by the way, quite an unusual sort of civil servant, our former central bank governor, who worked his whole life in one institution. Expertise is, helpful. It'd be good if we had some of it somewhere else. The truth is we were unequipped for the size of the task that we took on. British people thought the Olympics was going to be a disaster. Brexit is harder than the Olympics, right? Back in 2016, we didn't have a strategy that worked to accommodate the fact that 48% of the country thought this was a bad idea. The Conservative Party under Theresa May took the view that it would be politically advantageous to sort of privatise, to use a word that they used, the process of Brexit, so they would become the party of Brexit and they would own it. And that meant necessarily excluding visions of Brexit that didn't accord with their view. Right? They wanted a Tory Brexit. If you think through the way that trade negotiations and all long-term international negotiations work, actually the winner in most fights, if all else being equal, is the country with the greater consensus around its aims in the long run, right? Because these things take a long time. If you can be buffeted off your, by a coming election off your set of priorities, you will lose in any negotiation. And rather than trying to build a consensus around what the future relationship with Europe should be, we had this sort of peculiar thing where a single party tried to impose their vision of what Brexit should be on the rest of the country. And so there was no process of reaching out. There was no process of building consensus. When you ask people in Downing Street about why this was, it's because they kept saying, well, Theresa May felt that she would ask people, what do you think the future relationship would be? And people would say, well, this thing we've got over here is really important. We'd really like to preserve it. And she'd say, well, that's basically staying in for you. And they'd all say, yes, that's basically staying in for us. We think this is a really good idea for us to stay in our region. And she couldn't find places where people wanted to have great separation. So she, in her mind, took this decision, and it was a small number of people who took this decision, that we should leave hard and then try to work out what to buy back into. And this whole process meant that she also we didn't have a discussion at the beginning of the road about what the end state should be. Their thinking was that whatever happens at the beginning, there's going to be a sort of long route before we have to sort of make any choices. So the beginning of the withdrawal agreement is going to be the same whatever happens. So, we have some time, so we can start the process and keep going. The problem was that domestically, what this did was actually create a sort of vacuum into which a sort of Brexit theologies could emerge on both sides. So because we hadn't said at the beginning of the process, these are the industries we worry about. These are the industries we think are going to be our future. These are the industries that we think Britain's economy is going to be built on, and we need to have a relationship that preserves this and this and this and this. We ended up with a situation where zealots, basically on both sides, were able to start arguing among themselves, and they got into this sort of strange accelerationist theology. So you end up with these people who said before the referendum, we could be like Norway, we could be like Switzerland, who now say these are forbidden. These are completely, resiling on the request of the British people that was made in 2016. And Theresa May was sort of brought along with them. She ended up having to sort of resile repeatedly from commitments. So I think that's the big picture is without a consensus, we know that in these negotiations, whatever happens, even if we pass a withdrawal agreement today, these negotiations are going to go on for the rest of time, This relationship is one where we don't have any domestic capacity to form a decision on what should go forwards because in 2016, at the moment when it might have been possible, Theresa May chose not to try to build a consensus. There's a particular problem with Ireland and Northern Ireland, which actually is very difficult and possibly for outsiders to understand, partly because we don't understand it internally. So the United Kingdom is a union of 4 nations, England, Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland. The truth is, it's really, and the Whitehall consensus is a union of 3 nations, England, Wales, and Scotland, and we have custody of a 4th nation, Northern Ireland, temporarily, probably, until the Irish question can finally be resolved. At a moment at which there is a consensus within Northern Ireland that it should leave the United Kingdom, it will do so. That is the logic of the Good Friday Agreement. Until that moment, comes to pass, we have this sort of adopted child, right? We have repeatedly tried to get rid of Northern Ireland, right? We don't talk about this. In the 40s, during the Second World War, Winston Churchill offered Northern Ireland to Ireland. The price for which he asked for it was, can we use some of your ports, right? We don't care. It's not considered part of us. When we see the guys with flags and drums and flutes, right? These aren't British people. This is madness. This has nothing to do with us. I'm Roman Catholic too. I mean, my family has views on Northern Ireland that hope for reunification, right? There are more Roman Catholics in Britain, by the way, than in England than there are Presbyterians. We don't understand Northern Ireland. We don't get it. That's quite an important fact because fundamentally, until the 1990s, until 1999, when Scotland got the Scottish Parliament, that was kind of the consensus view. The Tory politicians used to continually utter the refrain that Britain has no selfish or strategic or economic interest in the continued ownership of Northern Ireland. We didn't see it as part of us. And that's really important to understand because the elite opinion in Whitehall always continued to have that view. The Good Friday Agreement is an enormous concession in sort of geopolitical terms. And, we've effectively ceded the future loss of a piece of territory. In 1999, the Scottish Parliament was established, which gave voice to Scottish nationalism. A lot of Tories now understand secessionism as an idea, and it's an idea they've learned to understand through Scotland. And they view the future breakup of the United Kingdom now, because they have had to continually fight Scottish nationalists, as a really serious problem. So they have learned this behaviour from Scotland that you have to fight nationalists and that we are against people who want to leave the United Kingdom. And they've learned it in Scotland. And the problem is that that doesn't really work in Northern Ireland, where, as I say, we are the sort of foster parents of this weird part of the country. The big problem we had, I'll finish up with this with how this sort of played into the negotiation, was that fundamentally, Britain believed that this negotiation was going to be between Britain, France, Germany, maybe Italy and Spain would, get to come in. The imperial powers would sit together, maybe in Vienna for the resonances. We would carve up how this was going to work, and then we could all move on. The idea that a little country, as Gisela said, the idea that a little country would get to have a say over what we did, this is ridiculous, especially Ireland, which is basically part of us, right? Was absurd. There was also, you mentioned, Tom, the sequencing thing. Lots of people in Britain fundamentally believe that because the sequencing required us to make a commitment about the border of Northern Ireland before we got a future relationship, that the EU wasn't going to stand by the requirement on the sequencing. The sequencing would collapse, and that what would happen was Ireland would come in one day and say, oh my God, we've just realised we've screwed this up by making you put our needs first. We've really put ourselves in a terrible position, which is bonkers. But it was what, we had this unskilled set of negotiators who were skilled by the end, by the way, but it was a steep learning curve. And we had a group of politicians who had no experience and no understanding of any of this, who believed basically that every time there was a tension in the negotiations, it would break our way, that every time there was a problem, it would, the cards would fall in our direction. We believed that the Irish soon enough would say, hang on a minute, this is going to be really bad economically for us. So we have to give the British whatever they want. It's mortifying how incompetent the domestic management was. But fundamentally, the failure to build a consensus, to have an argument prior to starting the negotiations at which these tensions could be brought out and resolved, is remarkable. I'll end by one point saying, during these negotiations, the UK government produced a future industrial strategy, which is quite odd, actually. Britain doesn't really do industrial strategy. We don't really believe in the state having a view about what the future sources of income for the state should be. But the things they chose were all were finance, right, bye-bye, and highly regulated manufacturing, things that are utterly reliant on regulatory integration between the United Kingdom and the EU as our future strategy. There is no strategy that is comprehensive or coherent that's being embarked on by the UK state. There is no understanding of how our Union of Four Nations works. There is no understanding of how the EU will put the interest of its own members above others, even little members. Even Slovenia matters more than, Britain. The idea of this is mind-blowing in Whitehall. I mean, the fact that the next round of negotiations, if we leave with no deal, we're going to have Spain arguing about Gibraltar, we're going to have Cyprus arguing about the sovereign basic areas, we're going to have a whole new range of things that we managed to sort of box in and keep contained, because every single one of the 27 is going to have a veto over the future relationship.
It's one of the strangest things about the debate about no deal from people who are advocates of it, that none of it focuses on the huge loss of leverage in the process, or how much more difficult it will be to negotiate a future relationship not through the Article 50 process, and through a different treaty process. And
I think the weird thing is we've behaved as though, so the first round of negotiations, we had this idea that we'll go to Estonia and we'll tell Estonia, guys, that we contribute about 150 troops to your defence. I think you have to really think twice about being tough enough, and this would split the EU. Actually, that's the sort of process that might work in the second round, because it's going to be a negotiation where all 27 nations have a veto. We're going to have to literally go around and buy off individual states for the second round. In the first round, it was all about the Commission and Stefan's team. But actually, one of the slight embarrassments was I've heard from lots of diplomats in other states who'd say, they get British plenipotentiaries coming over to them to say, look, have you thought about this for the Brexit deal? And they'd say, okay. So what is it that you want? And we'd shrug and say, actually, we're not really sure yet. We don't really have a plan, but we thought we should have a conversation. The whole thing has been so incompetent.
So ringing endorsement of the process thus far.
Could just
Yeah,
add
come in.
something? There's this, if you ever buy a British newspaper, there's a cartoonist called Matt, who on a daily basis encapsulates Britain in a way which no one else does. And in about 6 months after the referendum, I bought one of his cartoons because I thought he was very funny. And it still hangs in my office, and I increasingly want to weep every time I walk past it. And the cartoon is a couple in a restaurant reading the menu, and he turns to her and he says, "This is a European-themed restaurant. We won't tell them what we want, and they won't give it to us." That's fair. Yep.
I would like to come back to there's some really interesting points there, Chris, and particularly on the discussion about Northern Ireland. I would just be. Do you think there's a slight generational thing there as well, in that there was a group of politicians around from the 90s, both Conservative and Labour, much more closely involved in the peace process, and for whom the experience of IRA terrorism and the domestic policies that was much more real. And if, given what you said is true, that basically for many of these politicians, Northern Ireland doesn't have the same position, it's a bit of a foreign country to them, to use a phrase. Why aren't they willing to accept a completely distinct arrangement for Northern Ireland? Because the logic of that would be, of course we need a separate arrangement for Northern Ireland. It has distinct constitutional position created by the Good Friday Agreement. It has distinct politics and parties and traditions and tensions, and it's made all this progress. Of course, we need a separate arrangement to protect that.
So I think so. So there's a generation of people of politicians who are brought up in the idea that the United Kingdom has no selfish, strategic or economic interest in Northern Ireland. And that is sort of what became the Good Friday Agreement's concept of consent, which is to say, if the people of Northern Ireland want to leave, we believe in self-determination. For those people, they understand the sort of semi-detached nature of Northern Ireland's position with the United Kingdom. And this isn't, I mean, I'm putting it in bolder terms than a British politician would put it, which is no, it's up to the people of Northern Ireland. But we should be clear that Northern Irish Unionists accepted the principle that in the event that there is what we call a border poll, so there's a clear consensus, and it wouldn't have to be more than 52-48, by the way. If there's a clear consensus, an overwhelming and acceptance of the idea that Northern Ireland should become part of the Republic, then that should happen. There are two big things here, right? So the first is, as I mentioned, so 1999 we set up the Scottish Parliament, and a load of Tories became indoctrinated with this idea. Northern Ireland got parked in 1998, right? And in 2011, we moved the bulk of the expertise in London about Northern Ireland to Belfast because things were going well, right? So we didn't need them. It became a local thing. We can park it to one side. We can send them over there. Then in 1999, in parallel, the Scottish Parliament was set up. We got a resurge in Scottish nationalism. In 2007, they took over the government in Edinburgh. And for the second generation of Tories, part of Toryism is fighting nationalists who want to leave the United Kingdom. And the two things have happened sort of in sequence and in parallel. I think you put your finger on a really important point, which is there is actually clearly a stable withdrawal agreement out there, which is one where Northern Ireland is treated differently to the rest of the United Kingdom, as Northern Ireland is treated differently to the rest of the United Kingdom in a whole host of things. In a normal period, a group of Tory MPs who've got this sort of thing about Scotland in their heads would always vote against it. Like, they've learned unionism. It's an unthinking unionism. It's a weird juvenile unionism, but it's a unionism. And there would be a problem. But a decent-sized Tory majority would normally be able to simply accept the concept that we have no special or strategic or economic interest in Northern Ireland and vote that through. The relationship with the DUP has made that absolutely impossible, and I think you'd always have needed, because of this learned unionism, you'd always have needed a decent Tory majority to pass that. But that is obviously a stable thing. There is the weird thing is, my view is that the sort of February 2017 draft withdrawal agreement is a better candidate for passing in the long run and stability in the long run than the November one, which has the all UK customs union. Because I think fundamentally it's really hard to say to someone in like Woking in Surrey, so in southeast England, it's really important that you have regulatory alignment with the European Union, because in Ireland there are people who might have some terrorist issues. It's really hard sell to people in England who, as I say, view Northern Ireland as a foreign country by and large. To preserve the peace in Northern Ireland, you have to, what cars you buy and how your manufacturers should be regulated have to be fixed in Surrey and Kent. That doesn't feel politically stable to me.
Thanks, Chris. Martin, maybe I could turn to you to think a little bit sort of longer term. We focused quite a bit on where Brexit came from, how the negotiations have gone, and maybe in the questions we can talk a little bit more about where things might go in the short term. But you've written a little bit about how the UK kind of social and economic model was both a contributing factor to how we ended up with Brexit in the first place, but also that it will be fundamentally changed by leaving the European Union. And you've written in a piece about what you call the other Brexit question, which isn't how do we leave, but what sort of country are we going to be? So where do you think the UK might be in 5 years, and what might its relationship with the EU look like?
How many years did you say?
5. If you need
I
10,
think that's,
you can
yeah.
take 10.
I think even more. Maybe it's the. Thank you. Thanks for having me. Just one sentence, if I may, on Chris. I think Theresa May was an exception, maybe, to this attitude to Northern Ireland. I think she felt deeply, emotionally, politically about the union of the four nations. That explains some of the process she went through. It's kind of by the by now, but
I think that's,
you agree with that? Yeah.
I think that is right. She's a weird character
Yeah.
in that. The other thing about her is that she's a weird character in feeling the four unionism thing.
Yeah.
But the other thing about her that's weird is that she's a securocrat, right? You know, she's come from the Home Office, and
So she listened to the police.
so yeah, basically. So she had a parade of people from the security services coming in to say her, saying there really can't be a border. There really can't be a border. But she did agree to the original joint report, which proposed, you know, for want of the better term, a border in the Irish Sea between Northern Ireland and Great Britain.
Which, if people haven't noticed, in a letter 2 weeks ago from Boris Johnson to Donald Tusk, the new PM explicitly stepped back from that particular provision in that December 2017 joint report. It hasn't been picked up so much, but I think that was a significantly explicit change in policy. But to your question, I'd like to kind of get into it by going back to some of the things Gisela started out with, because she said a couple of very wise things that, to me, lead to very different conclusions. But that's fine, we disagree. But one thing she said was how the Leave campaign was about place, community, and identity, whereas the Remain campaign, she generously, I have to say, described as economic prosperity for tomorrow. You know, less generous would be to say it was all about hard cash in your wallet and kind of unfeeling kind of arguments. It's quite right. It was about place, community, identity, and place, community, and identity won. The point I want to make is that, first, there's a very deep identity division in the UK, and perhaps particularly England as a whole. Identity isn't just something that happens in Northern Ireland and Scotland. In the end, the Brexit vote and everything that's happened after it, more and more have become sort of identity markers. But identity and this sense, very real sense of declining communities in many parts of England in particular, I would like to argue have a very economic basis. And it's quite old. It goes back to the 70s, 80s at least, and deindustrialization that had hit some of these communities very hard. The same communities, sort of northern industrial communities, very rural or peripheral parts of southwest England, Cornwall, Wales, old mining communities, they were hit by deindustrialization. They were on the wrong side of globalization and trade with poor countries in particular. They're on the wrong side of technical change and how our economies change and favor knowledge industries that happen to thrive in big cities rather than in former industrial towns or rural areas. They're on the wrong side of a lot of developments. And that is one root cause, I think, of these dividing identities. There are parts of the UK that have had it very bad for 30, 40 years. Too few people know that the UK has the worst regional inequality in Europe. London, parts of London, is the most productivity, highest income region in Europe. The poorer parts of England and Wales are about at the level of the poorer parts of Portugal and Slovakia. Huge regional disparities. And these have been there for a long time. Very little of this had to do with EU membership, and a lot of it had to do with the economic changes I've talked about and the incapacity, again, or unwillingness of the British state to address it. Administrative capacity or incapacity is one thing. Governing capacity is something else. It wasn't just sort of the technical ability to carry things out. It was a governing neglect of some of these places, probably linked to how the electoral system works and so on. And a failure of policy, most of which was entirely in UK hands all along. So that's one point I want to make by way of introduction. This is the problem that the UK will have to solve in or out of the UK, in or out of the EU. The other thing Gisela said was that the accession of the UK to what was then the European Economic Community in 1973 was largely understood as taking part in a process of purely economic integration. People are a bit divided on how to interpret that. You read some speeches talking about political union and so on. You can add that every time there's been a step in further integration, sovereign UK governments and parliaments have accepted it. But that's not the point I want to make. Even taking that as sort of a common view, economic integration has more and more become an issue of having common rules. Economic integration isn't so much about taking away tariff barriers at the border anymore. Tariffs on the whole around the world have come down a lot since the 50s, 60s, 70s. Well, in some sectors it's significant, agriculture, to some extent auto manufacturing, cars. But economic integration today really means to agree on a common set of rules so that the way we produce things, or more importantly, provide services in one country, is acceptable in another country. This is what the single market is about. And once you understand that, you see that economic integration now isn't opposed or kind of separate from joint sovereignty. It's the same thing. To be an integrationist, a trade liberalizer today, is to be somebody who wants to pool sovereignty in some acceptable way. This is what the EU has done. It's kind of hard to understand conceptually, it's hard to understand on the ground. A lot of us, I include myself, have learned a lot about how this has actually worked once we've had to figure it out after the referendum to understand what it would mean to undo it. But I think it's a deeply important point that economic integration today, if you're really serious about it, means willingness to accept common rules. You can do that by having a say in them, or you can do that by simply accepting what a bigger trading bloc decides. I'm from Norway, that's the Norway model, deciding that it's actually important to trade as freely as possible with the European continent. That means accepting the rules set by them. Norway has chosen to be outside of the EU, so has virtually no say on the rules. It's a democratic problem, but it works. It might not work, would not work for the UK, I don't think, in the long run. But the single market, this sort of pooling of sovereignty, common rules, so that we don't need to check whether products or services comply when they cross a border. This was a UK project. It was the big UK project of the 1980s. It was what the UK government wanted to achieve at the time with its membership in the EU, and it succeeded. It was a British victory. We can add that another British victory was pushing for early integration of Central and Eastern Europe. That was a push in the 90s and succeeded in 2004. That too was a British victory. We saw in the referendum that the fact that those were victories had kind of been forgotten or never really expressed in a way that most of the population appreciated. And so there was a lot of the referendum was about buyer's remorse without even understanding it was buyer's remorse, not liking the effects of the things that Britain had successfully pushed for. Now, economic integration in terms of common rules, you see it in particular in some of the sectors that I think Chris touched on in this industrial strategy. The most, the economic areas where the UK does best are first, sort of high-value services, and second, high-value-added sophisticated manufacturing. And the iconic examples of each is finance, obviously, and the services, and car making, auto manufacturing on the manufacturing side. These depend enormously on the single market, that British victory, and also the customs union. Similar arguments apply. In services, because there are common rules that anything that a British service provider comes up with can be sold across the continent. And we know that about banking, but it's much more than finance. I mean, some examples I wasn't aware of before the referendum but have become aware of is fashion. There are European rules on protecting fashion design, copyright and fashion design, that are quite strong. That makes it easy to be London-based and come up with fashions and not be ripped off by copycats in other countries. It holds for broadcasting. London's a good place to be a broadcasting corporation. And I'm thinking about sort of global TV companies or production companies, because from there it's a culturally rich city, and you can sell into the entire European market. And there are plenty of examples like that. Now, those sectors are those that benefit the parts of the population that have already done well, the kind of upper part of the division, if you like. The manufacturing bit is very different. Car manufacturing is the sort of industry that provides, first of all, it provides good jobs and a way into high value-added jobs for people who may not have the formal qualifications or the social connections or have gone to Oxbridge or whatever, to have good jobs. And in regions that are not London, right? That are not the big metropolitan service knowledge-based city. This too depends a whole lot on the frictionless trade with Europe. Now, all of this matters because when you think forward, as Chris hinted, it's very hard to see what sort of solution to the deep economic divisions I've talked about and the neglect, multi-decade neglect of parts of England in particular, you could come up with that would involve making things harder for those sectors. I'll say that again. It's very hard to see how you would solve the UK's fundamental social and economic problem in ways that would make it harder for those types of sectors. That realization, I think, describes quite a lot of the process that Theresa May and her government went through. Remember, she started out pretty much where Boris Johnson is now. At least rhetorically, she may not have felt it in the same way. She may not have meant it in the same way, if we can know anything about what Boris Johnson actually intends. But all the sort of steps along the way you can attribute to realizing what I have just said about how the UK economy and the society built on it functions. So I think that this logic and this reality, whatever happens in the next 6 weeks, whatever the form of the withdrawal agreement or no withdrawal agreement takes, this reality doesn't go away. And the economic and political logic that follows from it also doesn't go away. And at some point, decisions will have to be made on the other Brexit question. What are we going to do with this now? Okay, Brexit has happened in some form. Now what? What are we trying to do? Very quickly, I think, whoever is then in power will have to come to terms with the big threats to those sectors, and in particular, the manufacturing sector. There's an economic logic to it. There's a political logic that piggybacks on that, which is partly that you will have businesses lobbying for you not to destroy the way they work. This has happened quietly. It will be more and more vocal as these decisions will start to be taken, maybe irrevocably. And to the extent that the current stagnation continues, or a no deal or a disruptive deal comes to have real strong effects on the ground, you will also see, I think, popular protests related to the destruction of these kinds of jobs. Now, where does that lead? You know, I can't kind of predict a sort of political path or even a policy path towards this, but I think that all of this means that there'll be very, very strong reasons for a future government 5, 10, 15 years down the line to think about ways to build up these sectors, protect them and perhaps build them up even more strongly in the case of manufacturing. So if you could build up a car manufacturing type of industry, that's the sort of thing that will help the left behind areas. And that will necessarily force a policy direction that means very tight links with Europe. Now the way to that may go through a no deal and huge disruption. But I think that two types of scenarios are quite likely 15, 20 years down the line. One is that you end up where Theresa May ended up in her Chequers proposal, an attempt basically to have something very much like a customs union and single market alignment for goods, for the goods industry, and then let finance, suffer. Or something much closer than that again, a full alignment which would take away the purpose of Brexit altogether, which means a rejoin campaign politically, but also a sort of choice, economic choice, to go back in. So 20 years from now, I think it's probably more likely that the UK will have tried and maybe succeeded to rejoin the EU than that you'll have the very distant relationship that's now being set out.
So it's always a fun provocation to end on, but go on.
Just
Yeah.
just 30 seconds to react to that, but Martin describes legitimate, I think, some problems in the UK, but I still don't see how Brexit is a solution for those problems. Neither do I see how Brexit is a solution for restoring a sense of identity or place or community. It just makes it harder. I mean, you describe broadcasting. Some broadcasters in the UK have now relicensed their activity in the 27. So have banks, so have insurance, so have hedge fund managers or fund managers. These are not just high-paid, high-skilled jobs. Those activities also generate low-skilled, medium-skilled service providers to those activities. Investment has slowed down. Productivity has been negatively affected because you're going to establish trade barriers do not exist today. So we respect Brexit, but by all means, I need to react to this by saying this is not a solution to the problems that the referendum seemed to have put on the table, if that is what the referendum has put on the table.
Okay. Sorry, Chris.
Just
quick point.
on the sort of political sort of support for Brexit, I think Martin's right that it was sort of built on the left behind stuff is very important, and the majority for leaving the European Union relied on those votes. But it's important to remember the modal Brexit voter is historically a conservative voter, and historically and old. An annuity holder living in the southeast of England is a more typical Brexit voter than a former miner living in the north of England. So Martin's right that there's no majority for Brexit, and they're an important part of the Brexit coalition. Those are the left behind people. But the Labour Party did turn out 75, 80% of its voters to vote for Remain. It was the Conservative Party who turned out the bulk of their thing. The other thing is the weirdness of left behind as an idea is that to sort of link up your two thoughts actually is that the part of the country that voted most strongly for leave is Lincolnshire, which is in the sort of east of England. It's it's Britain's basically only flyover county, to use that terrible American term. The train line from London to Scotland runs through it, and you'd never get off, right? It's farmland, and it's sort of potatoes and historically it's like going to the Netherlands actually if you want to pot around some 15th century clothals and that sort of stuff. But Lincolnshire's going through a boom. Lincolnshire has an enormous food processing industry that's built exclusively on Accession 8, 2004 accession workers. So Boston, which is one of the big market towns, has grown by 15% since 2004, all East European workers. The problems of Lincolnshire are the problems of boom towns. So the housing prices are shooting up faster than wages, that sort of thing. So actually, to your 2 points, actually, one of the problems of Lincolnshire were being solved by the EU. The problem is that people there didn't like the way they were being solved, which is, Polish shops and Polish people, particularly Poles in Lincolnshire. It was identity clashing into the economic reality was the problem, not the left behind stuff. On Martin's point on left behind,
Just one sentence on that.
yeah,
There are left behind people in those boom towns.
that's true. Yeah. And the sensation of being left behind in Boston though is you've got a job and your housing costs are going up, right? It's a weird sort of thing. But that's just a public policy failure in Lincolnshire, not building enough houses. It's nothing to do with the EU.
Just very quickly, because I'm conscious we've got about 25 minutes left, and I do want to get in some comments from the audience. So just a final quick point.
So the other things on the British state is that the funny thing about the British state is if you were to just look at the publications over the last 25 years, the British state's done nothing but worry about these places. The problem is that it restricts itself to an incredibly narrow toolkit. So all of the policy proposals or have a sort of, what does this do for Doncaster, what does this do for Lincolnshire, what does this do for these places. The problem is their view is, well, we can pay teachers a little bit more, or we can try and move an agency to this town. There's no broader sort of thought process. And it's not because of the EU that we don't have that. It's because the United Kingdom is sort of the home of a particular kind of desiccated liberalism that doesn't really believe in the state doing anything that goes beyond quite a narrow thing.
Okay, right. I'd like to open up to kind of comments and questions from people in the audience. And if you could just introduce who you are. There is a roving microphone there. Monica, I hoped you were going to ask a question.
Thank you very much. And I commend Chatham House and the Bled Forum for having this fascinating discussion. I am a signatory to the Belfast Good Friday Agreement, and I was an elected member of the Northern Ireland Assembly. I find this fascinating because, Gisela, you make the point that you thought that the UK was very interested in small countries. It disproportionately considered small countries against being dominated by one power. I'd like to take issue with that, because did anybody, when they were going...
I said Germany was.
Yeah, so I thought you were suggesting that UK was interested in European integration because it was also interested in small countries, which to me is what part of the European Union is about. And that issue of identity is superb in that we have multiple identities which we had to reconcile. When I signed off on that agreement, the day I got up on Good Friday, I was European. It was our safety blanket, like those in the Balkans. We were no longer just Irish or British, but we could be both. But most importantly, for those of us at the table, we were European, because it was going to connect us. And it was the connection of Ireland, North and South. It was the connection of East-West relationships, which also included Europe, that we signed off on. But we never anticipated this was going to happen. So my question is, and I would suggest that nationalism is on the growth when we had settled that question in Northern Ireland because of Brexit, and that people now are discussing unification in a way they never were before. And that's a danger, because I'm also a commissioner to disband and dismantle armed groups. And at the minute, when I talk to these armed groups, both sides are saying, bring it on. So we have potentially got a reoccurrence of conflict as I go home tomorrow. That's exactly what I'm dealing with, is people talking about their potential for what we once had of 30 years of civil war. So my question to all of you is, will it take a tragedy? And you've given us 20 years of us potentially rejoining. But will it take a tragedy, or will it take good evidence to do the right thing? Yeah, you have tragedies without deaths, without bombs, without assassinations. And I don't want to be a scaremonger, because I am still negotiating the peace. And that's why I pay tribute to you, Stefan, for doing what you did. You got it. I don't know, Chris, whether I'm one of your adopted children. When you're adopted, you're meant to be permanent with your mother or father.
I changed to foster.
And then you change to foster.
Yeah.
So that makes me, you can give me back anytime. And that's the worry. And that's why I think Michel Barnier and the rest of Europe understood it. I think the Balkans countries understood it. And that's what we're now facing.
That's a really interesting book. Chris, do you want to come back on that? Thank you.
I think it's worth pointing out there have been 5 attempts this year to kill police service in Northern Ireland officers. So there was an attempt in Fermanagh the week before last, was it? Yeah. They phoned in a hoax bomb. The police went to it, and then they exploded a device nearby. And thank God we've not lost any PSNI officers just yet. I would also point out that from London, this was barely reported. Like, bombs going off in Northern Ireland is unfortunately part of the expectation of what life in Northern Ireland is like. At the moment, the political conversation in London doesn't really talk about terrorism returning actively, because no one wants to be seen to sort of say, we have to do this, otherwise the Provos, we have to do what the Provos want, right? No one wants for that to be a topic of conversation. I mean, we had a journalist killed, 2 months, 3 months, in May, was it? It's the problem we've got is fundamentally that Great Britain will sustain an enormous amount of pain within Northern Ireland before Great Britain notices. Which, I mean, I accept that my analogy may have been clumsy, but the point that Northern Ireland is not seen as part of us is the sort of critical thing. It is worth thinking of what no deal is, right? So no deal is a negotiating strategy that punishes the Republic of Ireland, this amount in the hope of forcing a deal, but it will put the Northern Ireland this amount. We are using a part of our country as a cudgel to hurt another country as part of a negotiating strategy. So my fear is that Northern Ireland will not be taken seriously enough in London, and the pain of Northern Ireland will not be taken seriously enough in London as a sort of long-term problem.
Gisela. Sorry.
Can I come back?
Go on,
I mean,
next
the 2 points. I mean, thank you, Stefan, what said about the Prosperity UK Commission on looking at the alternative arrangements, and I'm going to Belfast on Saturday. But Monica, you've just reminded me of something which I had meant to mention at the outset. I deeply, deeply, and really very deeply resent the hijacking of the word Europe for the Union. The Norwegians, I mean, I remember in 1973, the United Kingdom issued a 50p coin on their accession. And if you look at that coin of linked hands, it looks slightly odd. One of the hands is slightly odd because in the last minute they had to redesign it and take one out because Norway had decided in the referendum not to join. Norway and Switzerland and Albania and Serbia, to me, are just as European as Germany and all the others. But there's a political construct of the Union, and I think we should call it the Union. And I was born in Bavaria. My mother is Czech. I now live in the United Kingdom. And by the way, I represented Neville Chamberlain's old constituency for 20 years. And I always thought it was very striking that if anybody had said to Neville today, when Britain declared war on Germany, and Neville Chamberlain did, that if he'd said to Neville in 1997, your successor will be born in Munich, a socialist and a woman. But by the way, don't worry, it all came about by democratic means. The world has progressed, and some of them is been tremendous through the European Union, but I think we have fossilized in a sense that membership is the only mechanism. We never developed a proper neighborhood policy, which was not exclusive. And Martin's point about trade, you're right. You're so right about trade relationships, but increasingly those trade relationships are going to be global. When you talk to BMW and say, why did you do the Engine 3 series in the UK and the Mini? The BMW will say, the more sophisticated the technology, the closer the manufacturing unit needs to be to new technology. And more established the technology, it doesn't matter whether we're in Vietnam or whether we are in the Ukraine or whether we are in Poland. So the whole world is changing at a pace to which I would say the Union is not equipped to respond.
That's one quick question just to follow up on this and link to the points that Chris made earlier. You know Boris Johnson a little bit, enough to have texted him that you'd written an editorial encouraging him to vote for the withdrawal agreement. Do you think, what sort of unionist is he to fit in Chris's rubric? Is he somebody who really believes in unionism? Is he somebody who's sort of instrumentalising it for other purposes, or is he a kind of reflexive, learned from the Scottish experience slightly? How will he think about the situation in Northern Ireland?
Well, let me answer this in a slightly roundabout way. It was before David Cameron called the referendum. A group of us, which included Min Campbell, Peter Hain, and Robert Salisbury, who's sort of the Cecil's 400 years of British politics, we started setting up a constitutional reform group on the basis that the unanswered question of who speaks for England, which I think is a deep constitutional problem, much more fundamental than anything else, England outside London, and that the United Kingdom required a new constitutional settlement, which would bring those together, and we're continue to do some work on that. And I'd also would suggest, I mean, this is where if you go and do public polling and you ask the question of, if you're in the Midlands in Birmingham, for every £1 spent as a British taxpayer, you get £1's worth of of services back. London, it's the other way around, it's sort of 60 pence worth. The biggest contribution actually goes into Northern Ireland. And if you do the polling, the British public regards Northern Ireland as a absolute integral part of the United Kingdom.
I've seen what happens to TV viewership figures when you put Northern Ireland on telly. Right, it's not part of us.
Okay.
Sorry, quick point, Stefan. Yeah.
Quick point on this issue of neighborhood policy. I mean, we are 27 countries. Our closest economic friends are Norway and the other EEA countries, Liechtenstein, Iceland. We have an association agreement with Ukraine, and we have the Western Balkans pre-accession perspectives. So that's the neighborhood.
Pre-accession, it's always an accession process.
Well, it's what these countries...
No, what else is an offer? Morocco had to apply remember, when Spain joined, and there was a real problem helping Morocco. Morocco had to apply to become a member because there was no other mechanism
There we
of
have
helping
what
them.
is called a truly neighborhood policy, which is the immediate surrounding North Africa.
Oh, so they're real neighbours and not so near neighbours. So the Ukraine is not so near neighbour, but
Ukraine has
Morocco
an
is a near
association
one.
agreement. Ukraine has an association agreement with the EU. So I'm just saying that this neighborhood is not densely populated for the moment. And,
Partial access to the single market.
and European politics is, of course, driven by a regulatory giant and hopefully stronger political union in the future, which is the 27 plus, if things go well.
Okay, I'd like to take another question. Yes, sir, here in the middle.
Thank you very much. My name is Miles Gearan. I'm the Ambassador of Ireland to Slovenia and to Bosnia and Herzegovina. I first of all want to thank the Bled Strategic Forum and Chatham House for giving the time and space and compiling a panel that can offer some insights and perhaps move beyond the sound bites which too often Brexit can be reduced to. Much of what I was going to say has already been said by Stefan, and that's not a surprise because the withdrawal agreement was negotiated on our behalf as well. But there was a number of references to an Irish question, and throughout Irish history, many of the complex issues were reduced to this soundbite, as it were, as this Irish question. And if there ever was an Irish question, the answer to that Irish question was the Good Friday Agreement. And that was brought together by brave people like Monica McWilliams, who took a decision that was courageous to put together a consensus agreement that settled this question. And that question remained answered to a great extent up to the point of the vote in Britain, which Ireland regrets. We would like to see Britain remain in the European Union, but that is a sovereign decision of the United Kingdom. But that opened the question then in relation to the Good Friday Agreement. And the answer to that question is the backstop, which provides, as Stefan says, an insurance policy and a level of certainty that would not be otherwise there for an agreement that has provided peace and stability and growing prosperity in Northern Ireland. And when I speak about this in this region, it's a region that appreciates the fragility sometimes of peace, and that we don't do anything, certainly consciously, to undermine that. So just to recall those. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I'll take maybe a couple more points from the floor at this point. Would you like to ask a question? No questions. Okay. Oh, there's one here. Perfect.
Thank you for the floor. I'm Tamar from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Georgia. My question to the panel would be if you could elaborate a little bit on the alternative scenarios to the backstop arrangements, because there are some signals from London that the Prime Minister's office is preparing some alternative solutions to backstop, and there was a statement by Boris Johnson, some electronic pre-declarance of goods as an alternative to that. How feasible it might seem when there are less than 2 months left until Brexit, and if you could share your perspective on potential scenarios.
Thanks very much. Stefan or Chris, did you have your thoughts on that? Go for
I
it.
think I think one of the things that we've not mentioned actually is the Irish Department of Foreign Affairs, who if you take every adjective I use about Britain, have been the opposite. So they had a very clear political consensus in Ireland within the week of the of the decision to vote to leave. I think the Friday after the day, literally the day that the result came out, there was a meeting of party leaders in Dublin. The threat to the Good Friday Agreement, the threat to the island's sort of strategic posture was well understood and well articulated. By January 2017, so 7 months after the vote, the then Taoiseach and Kenny had taken a sequence of positions which were sort of completely solid on there won't be alternative arrangements, there won't be clever border technology, there won't be a border. And the fundamental thing about alternative arrangements is alternative arrangements are about managing the existence of a customs or regulatory border on the island of Ireland. And the Irish position is there will not be a border for those things on the island of Ireland, right? And so in a sense, Stefan will talk more constructively about these, I'm sure, but the political reality is that alternative arrangements cannot work because they are predicated on the idea that there should be a border on the island of Ireland. I'd also point out, by the way, one of the things about the DFA is their incredible work in the US. So one of the weird things about Britain is obviously we believe that we have this magical ability to influence the White House and that we are the secret puppet masters based on God only knows what. But one of the amazing things that's happened in the last sort of 6 months has been the realization that the DFA has gone to work in Washington. The Irish heritage and American voters have been mobilized on Brexit. The trade deals are going to have to respect the Good Friday Agreement between the United States and the United Kingdom. The extent to which, even in what we consider to be the thing we're good at, managing the special relationship, is the extent to which we've been sort of bested by what we regard as basically, a province of the United Kingdom, with all due respect to my friend there. And I say that with the frustration at my own country, is absolutely remarkable.
Stefan, alternative arrangements. Do you, in a sense, Chris, you've basically said alternative arrangements will never work. That's basically what you're saying. Is that fair?
I think an Irish government that consents to alternative arrangements will last possibly an hour, possibly 90 minutes, okay. But it's not going to happen.
At any point in the future? You mean, because
in the foreseeable future.
In the foreseeable future. So, and this is sort of the Brexiteer fear, isn't it? It's saying that, okay, we agree to the backstop as a temporary measure, but then nobody has any incentive to agree to any other arrangement because of that. And
if we believe in the alternative arrangements, we just stick them in the Irish Sea, right? We put them on the boats between Northern Ireland and Great Britain, but we don't believe they're real because they're not. If you can make a seamless border, I bet it's easier to do on a boat than it is to do across a field, right?
Yeah.
You're already stationary. You can have someone come up to the thing and scan or whatever. We can use RFID chips. You can do all that stuff.
That may be the answer that comes after an election, which means the DUP aren't supporting the government.
That's possible. I mean, I think the likeliest, as I say, the likeliest stable deal is one where there are checks in the Irish Sea between Northern Ireland and Great Britain. That's one that can last if we can get it through for the first time. The problem is obviously that it's not clear at all that that can carry in the House of Commons or a future House of Commons as things stand.
Do you share that degree of scepticism about alternative arrangements?
Well, to the point that Chris made, you dramatize checks on the ferries and on airport and on planes.
Dramatize or de-dramatize?
We've de-dramatized.
De-dramatized.
Or dematerialized or technologized or whatever word you may. We tried that during the negotiations. That didn't really take ground in the UK debate. The original feature of the backstop is built on Northern Ireland regulatory alignment to single market for goods and to the customs union, basically. And if you move away from that, then the question is what alternative arrangements are there and how do you manage then that border? The question that first comes to mind is the complexity of sanitary phytosanitary standards, which today happen on an all-island basis. And I don't see any reason why tomorrow they cannot. But we have to be blunt about this in terms of the Good Friday Agreement, the delicate balance between competing political identities in Northern Ireland. That means indeed that those checks will go up in volume. I mean, there's no denying that in terms of entry point to the island, if that's part of the future subsequent agreement that we may want to conclude with the UK. Then comes the question of what you do with customs and customs formalities. And again, the original feature of the backstop is it erases them in terms of Northern Irish border traffic. And There, of course, you can do lots of facilitation and technology and all kinds of issues, but the question still remains between which jurisdictions does it happen? And that's, but again, we have committed to work on this, hopefully as of November, but well, Brexit, where next is the question, so let's see. But on the subsequent agreement that replaces the backstop in part or in full.
Thanks. Are there any final questions? Because I have one final question for the panel, but if there aren't any, then I will ask my question, which is a quick fire round in which I ask you where Britain will be on the 1st of November.
This year.
In or outside the EU, and who's in government?
It would have left and you have a Tory government.
With no deal?
I think you end up with a no deal immediately followed by a number of small deals.
Chris, what do you think?
I think it's quite hard to see a passageway that doesn't lead to no deal at the moment. Okay. But I might give a different answer tomorrow.
Okay, that's fair. Martin, what do you think?
Yeah, it's okay. I think in the last week of October, Boris Johnson will declare victory, wave something that's surprisingly similar to the existing withdrawal agreement, with some fig leaves that allow him, or that he uses to say that this is very different and he's won on all points. It will be voted through the House of Commons and they'll leave on October 31st with pretty much the existing deal.
Okay. Martin, does Michel Barnier have a fig tree with plenty of leaves available for...
I mean, your question, I hope there's a new commission the 1st of November. I can only say where the EU will be, or where the UK will be. That's a choice for the UK. Will it choose the orderly Brexit or no deal? I don't know. I mean,
and the EU will be ready whatever happens?
And if it's a no deal, we need to manage that, and we will manage it unilaterally on the side of the 27. There will be no mini deals. Our work is done. The legislation has been adopted by Council and Parliament. The stakeholders know what they have to do. Whatever happens, no deal, I think we need to keep our eye on the ball of a close future relationship with the UK. No deal just gives a much more bumpy road, to use an expression, to get there.
All right, it's not an end point, and this discussion will no doubt go on, but I want to thank you all for a really interesting, thoughtful contributions, and also contributions from the floor, and I hope everyone enjoys the rest of the conference, and thank you all for coming.